Hey guys, and welcome back to another Disturb-Your TV presentation. Growing up as a 90s kid, in the era of PlayStation and big budget Hollywood movies that you had to rent from Blockbuster or record by VHS from one of the 5 channels that TV had to offer at the time, was a memory I'm sure many of you would remember, and even cherish. Me, I was fascinated by films like Scarface, Goodfellas and The Godfather, that were glorified on the silver screen for your viewing pleasure. But the story we are going to look into today couldn't be any further from that. Let me begin. If I was to ask you what you think when you hear the word Mafia, what would you say? Probably 1980s New York, right? Or Al Capone, Chicago. Pinstripe suits, in secret meetings and not so secret places. Tommy guns, Lincoln town cars and Cadillacs cruising up the boulevard, and broad daylight hits that take place in barber shops like what happened to Albert Anastasia. Or maybe you'd remember the hit outside a Manhattan steakhouse on Big Paul Castellano on December 16th, 1985, orchestrated by none other than John Gotti, the Teflon Don himself, and Sammy the Bull Gravano of the Gambino crime family. If those were your first thoughts, then I'm sure you were not alone, as there are many more who would have said the same, and you'd be right in thinking that the life of a gangster is not as it is portrayed in the movies, but instead dangerous and barbaric, where all morals get thrown out of the window and replaced with murderous tendencies, constantly looking over your shoulder as any seemingly harmless mistake could get you rubbed out. But what if I was to tell you there was someone far worse than all? And when I say far worse, I really mean beyond comprehension. I really mean as close to genocidal as humanly possible, practically the Grim Reaper in human form, knocking on your door with a big grin on his face, ready to make you disappear. I am of course referring to a man by the name of Roy Demeo, the Mafia serial killer, and the horrors that took place inside of the Gemini lounge, located on Flatlands Avenue, Brooklyn. Roy Albert Demeo, born on the 7th of September 1940 in Flatlands, Brooklyn, to Italian immigrant parents of Neapolitan origin. Being the 4th of 5 children, it is said that Roy was often bullied by the other kids in the neighbourhood, unless his older brother was around, who died in World War II, where it is said after this, Roy turned cold. There is not much known of Roy's early life, but what we do know is, Roy Demeo's life of crime started early, and by the time he had graduated from James Madison High School in 1959, he was already running a small-scale loan sharking operation. Oh, I forgot, he was also an apprentice butcher at a local grocery store, where the skills he learnt there would come in handy later on. No pun intended, and if you didn't get that, it's fine. It will become very obvious and abundantly clear very soon. Roy Demeo became an associate of the Canarsie faction of the Lucchese crime family in the Flatlands area, and around the age of 18 he was controlling tow truck companies and a car theft operation ring in Brooklyn. In 1966 he met Nino Gaggi, also known as Anthony Gaggi, a soldier but later becoming a capo in the Gambino crime family. He noticed Roy and essentially became his mentor, telling him that he would be better off working directly with the Gambinos, as it would be much more lucrative and he would earn much more money, which he did. Eventually his car theft and loan sharking operation grew, and before much longer had clients like a dentist office, flea markets, restaurants, and even an abortion clinic. And to explain his wealth he would frequently tell his neighbours he worked in the used car industry and also construction. Sounds familiar. Roy and Nino carried on loan sharking and before much longer started recruiting, pretty much like a job centre, if that was a thing. The first member of the Demeo crew was 16-year-old Chris Rosenberg, who met Demeo when he was dealing marijuana at a Canarsie gas station. Demeo helped Rosenberg increase his business and profits by loaning him money so that he could deal in larger amounts, and by 1972 Rosenberg had introduced his friends to Demeo and they began working for him as well. Eventually, Roy had formed and had his own faction, aptly named the Demeo crew, a force to be reckoned with, and one you certainly didn't want to get on the wrong side of, because if you did, you knew you was in trouble. This crew had such members as the Gemini twins, also known as Joseph and Patrick Tester, and Henry Borelli and Vito Arena, known as Little Vic, born August 4th, 1934, and was a New York mobster who one day would become acting boss of the Colombo crime family. Arena tried to seize power of the family and take it from the then boss Carmine Persico, who was at the time locked up for racketeering, which started a war that went on for 2 years and was said to be one of the bloodiest wars in Mafia history. Anyway, back to the star of the show. Roy Demeo married Gladys Rosamond Britton in 1960, the same year his father died, and in 1966 Demeo moved into a custom-built home in Massapequa, Long Island, where he lived with his wife and 3 children. The couple had 2 daughters and a son, and was religious. Demeo was raised Catholic, but stopped practicing the religion in later life. But Gladys was a Lutheran who still raised the children with these beliefs, and by all accounts, Roy was able to balance a mobster's double life of homicidal violence with parenthood, in a home he was said to have been a great father. In 1973, police break down the door of Paul Rothenberg, the main distributor of adult-rated films across New York City, and was questioned about checks to Demeo, and once he found out, fearing the long arm of the law, something had to be done. So Nino Gadji ordered the hit on Rothenberg, which was said to be Demeo's first commissioned hit, and Demeo carried it out in Long Island, chasing Rothenberg through the alleys like an animal, and brutally beating him before shooting him dead with a silenced .38 with 2 bullets to the head. I mean, I guess you gotta do what you gotta do, right? And that's just one to the list of an ever-growing body count that would start stacking up like a Jenga tower. In 1974, Demeo found out from a police officer on his payroll that Andrea Katz, a partner of his in the car theft operation, was essentially ratting out and setting up a meeting with the district attorney's office about another Demeo crew member, Chris Rosenberg, and his involvement in the car theft ring. Katz had a bone to pick with Rosenberg due to him being arrested over a stolen car that Rosenberg had not properly altered the VIN plates for. Katz shot Rosenberg in the face with a rifle, but he survived with a minor deformity in the jaw. Rosenberg's end was not far away, and Katz later stood before a grand jury and spilt the beans. Unfortunately for Katz, Demeo got wind of this, and I think we all know what was coming next, and at very best, it wasn't going to go well for him. Because on June 13th, 1975, Demeo lured Andrea Katz to an apartment through an acquaintance of his, a woman by the name of Barbette Kestrel, for a supposed date, and it seems Katz took the bait and couldn't read the signals and was clearly led on, right to his death. Katz went to the place they had agreed and was then abducted by Demeo's ever-faithful henchman and taken to the meat section of a supermarket in Queens, where he was stabbed in the heart numerous times and beheaded. After, his head was put into a cardboard compactor with the rest of his body being dismembered and being wrapped and disposed of in plastic bags, eventually being found in a dumpster because one of his legs was found curbside just outside of it. I mean, come on, Roy. You can do better than that. Now, if you remember, as I said earlier about Demeo's butchering skills coming in handy, I think you get the point. Roy was now well on his way to becoming inducted into the Mafia's Hitman Hall of Fame and started to make quite the impression on Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, and throughout all of this, anyone that needed to be gone was eliminated, courtesy of the Demeo crew. Let's move on. This mobster, started to enjoy this act a little too much, and from a fairly recent interview with Sammy the Bull on Vlad TV, he described having a meeting with Demeo about business as usual in a quiet little cafe mainly occupied and frequented by middle-aged people and pensioners. Throughout the conversation, Sammy could see that Demeo's attention was lacking somewhat, so he asked Demeo if he was boring him. To put it bluntly, Demeo responded by saying, Imagine if I had two 9mm right now, and I quote, "I could blow these away before they even got out their seats." Sammy replying, "That's if they didn't all have heart attacks," humouring him, but deep down knowing this guy was a problem, fantasising about killing a room full of old people. When describing evil, if this isn't something to go by, then I don't know what is. I mean seriously. Even ex-mob hitman Sammy the Bull knew he was a different piece of work. And when Sammy says that, you know you were wronging. And believe me when I say this, the story doesn't get any better, as Sammy went on to say that Demeo liked to keep his men sharp and on point, and that Roy's uncle was a bartender at the Gemini lounge, and supposedly, if you was the first person to walk in, unlucky you, as he would call up Roy to tell him, "We got one," and the innocent victim would then be dragged out to the back and shot in the head, cut from the neck to the groin and hung upside down by their feet for the blood to be drained, so when dismembering their body, blood would not be shooting everywhere. All this in the name of keeping loyalty and respect. I mean, people were disappearing left, right and centre like a Houdini act. It is said that Roy had murdered up to 200 people, dismembering them and disposing of them like curbside garbage right from inside the Gemini lounge. So I don't think it would be a surprise if I told you that the Gemini lounge is said to be haunted, which ironically now is a church. Weird or what? You just couldn't write this shit. Anyway, it was a bar that Demeo became a silent partner in, as the owner Phil Grande was a through and through gambler, owing Demeo money. Clearly Phil wasn't a wise guy. Demeo famously even had a technique of murder named after him, called, get this, the Gemini method, which I will now break down for you. A victim was lured into the Gemini lounge through a side door and into the rear apartment. Inside, a Demeo member with a silenced pistol and a towel awaited. The victim was then shot in the head, then the towel was wrapped around to soak up the blood. Another member then stabbed the victim in the heart to control bleeding. After confirming death, the body was then stripped and drained of blood in the bathtub, and then dismembered in the main room. Body parts were bagged up and placed in cardboard boxes for disposal at the Foster Avenue dump in Brooklyn to avoid discovery. No wonder they was dubbed the Murder Machine. Basically, they were a powerhouse of efficient killers that had it down to a T with impeccable timing, and in more ways than one, it brings a whole new meaning to the words chop chop, as the most ironic thing of all of this is that Demeo not only owned his own chop shop, cutting up the car parts into pieces to cover up his ill-gotten gains, but was in the spare time also doing the same but with humans, snatching them from the streets and cutting them up too. Demeo's crew with Rosenberg got involved with some Cuban men down in Florida. Rosenberg set up a deal with one of the men, and when they travelled to New York, Rosenberg killed him and his associates. Problem is that the men they had killed had links to the cartel, and they wanted revenge, and the Gambino faction did not want to get into it with them. The cartels wanted Rosenberg gone, and Demeo was the man for the job, and it was assigned to him. Only, he stalled for weeks. Demeo knew he needed to get the job done, but was close with Rosenberg. Therefore, he chose to hide out, but growing increasingly paranoid. One day, a young boy by the name of Dominic Rigucci, with no ties to the criminal underworld, was doing door-to-door sales to pay for his tuition. Demeo saw him sitting parked outside his home in Long Island and assumed he was a Cuban hitman sent by the cartel, which was not the case. Demeo and crew members Joseph Guglielmo and Freddie Dianomi pursued Rigucci in a 7-mile car chase on Route 110 through Amityville and Farmingdale, after which the student was shot to death by Demeo. The execution of Rigucci infuriated Nino Gaggi, Demeo's partner, and ordered him to kill Rosenberg before there were any more innocent victims. So on May the 11th, 1979, Rosenberg attended the Gemini lounge for a meeting, not a good sign, and as he entered he was met by Demeo, who shot him once in the head, and amazingly for the second time of being shot in the head, was still alive, bent down and kneeled on one knee. However, not for long, as Anthony Center, a crew member of Demeo's, moved in and fired 4 more shots into Rosenberg's head. The Cubans wanted this murder to be front page news, not only as a statement, but as proof the job was done. so Rosenberg's body was placed in his car and left on Crossway Boulevard next to the Wildlife Refuge in Queens to be found. This was said to have affected Roy a great deal, and after the murder of his friend went to the study room of his house and did not come out for 2 days, later going into hiding as quoted by his son Albert Demeo, written in the book he had wrote, For the Sins of My Father. Hits were put on the head of Demeo by Paul Castellano due to concerns of Demeo becoming erratic and being an accomplished serial killer, but he had the street so shook and scared, not only of him but the team of professional killers around him. In fact, they struggled to get someone to take it up. Even John Gotti was reluctant to do so, though fate would have it, when you gotta go, you gotta go. And in the end, Demeo got a little carried away just like his victims, and if he thought for just 1 second that it wouldn't inevitably come back to bite him in the arse, he was wrong. Dead wrong. Because on January 10th, 1983, he would be found shot dead in the boot of his own car in Brighton Beach, New York, frozen stiff with multiple bullet holes in his chest, back and head, with his arm covering his face, which police say was in defence. Or maybe he was just saluting his prior life. Either way, in his last few seconds on Earth, Roy experienced the same horrors his victims did, and I'm sure you guys would find it hard to share a little sympathy for him, as I would confidently say he will go down in history rather than some of the worst killers who ever existed. Thank you guys.